Hi, welcome to podcast number 4 for the Fans in Training podcast. I'm Ashley DeCruz. I'm here with Brendan Reagan. So today we're going to talk about a few things in regards to how we really talked about food and portion sizes and the use of Canada's food guide throughout the program, and then we'll get on to talking about some sport at the end of the podcast as well. So one thing that we really used throughout the program was trying to teach men about portion sizes and the difference between portion size and a serving size. And we found that in one of the sessions we used plastic food and replica food to demonstrate to the men what a portion size, what their portion size may be and what a serving size is actually recommended. So that's one thing that we found, Brendan and I, that was a real eye-opener for the men. It became something that was synonymous with the program, really, and that they thought about throughout the 12 weeks, and this was introduced in session 2, as I said. So, Brendan, what were your thoughts when you introduced the plastic food and the replica food, and the feedback you got from the men during that part of the session?
Well, I think you nailed it on the head, Ash. It was definitely one of the biggest eye-openers for at least the group that I was working with. And as you mentioned, it was one of the first sessions as well. So I think that was a nice introduction to kind of improve maybe the awareness for a lot of these men for how much they're actually eating and how much a typical portion size actually is. So when we brought that plastic food in, I think a lot of them were surprised to see maybe how little the actual amount of food was per portion. And then we also brought in a few of their favorite foods. We actually encouraged and recommended that they bring in some of their favorite meals. And we had a look at the food label on the side of the box to actually look at how many servings there was and per, I guess, whatever entree they were actually eating. So I know in the group that I was working with, a few of them brought in some frozen pizzas, and they were very surprised to see that the food label was actually only per quarter pizza. And I know probably like many people, we eat more than a quarter pizza when we're looking at those frozen ones, at least. So that was definitely one of the biggest eye openers, and I think something that really helped improve the awareness for portion size versus how much we're actually consuming.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing that a lot of the men weren't aware of, what the difference between a portion size and a serving size is. Portion size being what they're actually eating, and the serving size being what's actually recommended. And you mentioned the pizza. That was one of the big things I found, that a 12-inch pizza, only a quarter of it was actually part of their serving size. And that kind of leads us nicely on to talking about food labels. And that was another thing that a lot of the men didn't understand what was it, the content of a food label or the importance of it. And that was the main thing. At the top of all food labels in North America, you'll see what's recommended as a serving size for that food. The frozen pizza is a great example. The soup is another good example. The amount of sodium or fat that's in some soups, especially the cream-based soups, and most people will have the whole can, where a serving size is actually half a can. So making sure that the men were aware of those food labels was another big eye-opener. Do you just want to speak on the food labels and how that became something that also was encouraged throughout the program for men to become aware of, and how they should be looking at them when they're both shopping and eating?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, a few of them were reluctant to begin doing that, but it really showed the value once we got in the habit of actually reading the food labels and looking to see what it is that we're consuming each time we eat. I know not just from a caloric intake perspective, which a lot of people obviously are interested in when trying to lose weight, but even just for, as you mentioned, how much sodium we're consuming or how many fats. So I think it's important that we do get in that habit and we're aware of maybe what some of our favorite foods actually consists of and we can find that out when we read those food labels. And the other thing that I think is important, Ash, is that although we're trying to eventually build up to what the Canada Food Guide recommends for the number of portions per day, what really worked for a lot of these men was just increasing maybe one portion of, say, fruits and vegetables per day so that we can eventually build up to what we want to get to. It doesn't have to be a drastic change right away to try and get within those recommendations. I think it worked best by trying to gradually increase just by one serving per week or per day, whatever worked best for these men.
Yeah, and we use those prescriptions that we've spoken about in previous podcasts for the healthy eating, which we're talking about today, but also the physical activity which we really just talked about increasing steps, and exercise as well, which was more about trying to increase the amount of moderate to vigorous intensity exercise that participants were doing. So talking about the healthy eating as we are today, and you've already mentioned Canada's Food Guide, it's something that we use as exactly what it's supposed to be used for, a guide, a resource to try and help these men incorporate the foods that they should be incorporating into their diet, and trying to increase or decrease the amount of servings they're having of certain food types. For example, lowering the amount of fats and increasing the amount of fruits and vegetables. So one thing that I also found, just touching back to the plastic food, when we mentioned about how surprising it was that some of these foods were so small when they were having so much of them as their actual portion size, is also the opposite. Some of the serving sizes of fruits and vegetables are actually quite small. Some men were kind of impressed with the fact that if they were having 2 or 3 what the serving size was recommend, that would incorporate into the recommended of around 8 a day per the Canada's Food Guide. So with Canada's Food Guide, it was introduced in 1942. It was actually originally intended its original intended design was for wartime rationing and malnutrition. So we've kind of gone away from that now. The last update was in 2007, but the Canada's Food Guide is being revamped and a new version will be brought out this year. It's kind of loose what's actually going to be incorporated into the new food guide, and I know there's been stuff in the media about what's been taken out of it and what's going to be increased into it. But what were your feelings about Canada's Food Guide and the importance of it, not just for the men, but for Canada in general, to try and get a balanced diet and a healthy diet?
Well, I think it's a great tool so that we can try and increase awareness for what exactly we should be eating. I think it's a good guide so that we're aware, not just as we've talked about for portion sizes, but also what types of food, right? As you mentioned, I know one of the groups is grains, so something that we really tried to encourage with the group that I was working with was trying to increase the number of whole grains as well that we're consuming within that category. And so what I found to be most effective was when we tried to increase the variety of foods within each group. I really think that if we can try and diversify the amount of food, the different types of foods, then it's a much more sustainable lifestyle, because you're not just eating the same thing over and over, and it's not maybe as repetitive as it would be having the same meals each time. So as I said, a good tool so that we can try and improve awareness for what everyone should be eating, but also it's important to try and make sure that we're having a variety of different foods within those groups.
Yeah, and it's not just a food guide per se in terms of what to consume and the guide around that, but it also does talk about how to understand food labels. It also talks about activity and how the balance, which we talk about throughout the program, the balance of making sure that the calories that you consume is being balanced off with the calories you're burning through exercise and physical activity. So going off to a slightly different topic here, well, throughout the program and going into our extensive program, we're using junior hockey teams. So junior A hockey teams in the Canadian Hockey League, and obviously that umbrella incorporating the Ontario Hockey League, the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, and the Western Hockey League. Brendan, why do you think it was important to use junior hockey teams in comparison to maybe NHL teams? The importance of that and keeping it within the Canadian Hockey League going forward and larger scale from west to east coast?
Well, I think a lot of professional sport teams try to help out within the community. I don't know if they maybe do as great of a job as they could be addressing some of the health needs, but what's really important is that we get some of these junior sport organizations, and obviously hockey worked well for us because it's much more prevalent within communities and rural communities in particular. So you don't necessarily have to be in a major city in order to receive access to this. So if we look at the NHL, for example, with only 7 Canadian teams in the entire country, if you don't live in one of those 7 cities, it might be difficult to access some of these community-oriented programs. And so if we can implement them across junior leagues, say for example the Canadian Hockey League, then they're much more prevalent in some of the communities where these needs exist and might even be exacerbated.
Yeah, and a lot of these places, it's the only show in town. They're quite a lot of small communities. Most of the teams are in communities that don't have a local NHL team, the exception of a few that maybe are close by. But yeah, it's really good to try and get those junior junior teams involved because they're a kind of a rallying point for the local community. So with playoffs coming up in not just the Canadian Hockey League, but also, well, they're already started, I guess, but also the NHL playoffs starting over the next couple of weeks. Who are you thinking? Who's going to make a run for it? I mean, as a Leafs fan, I was pretty confident a few weeks ago, but they've been extremely inconsistent, beating Nashville, throwing away a three-goal lead against Tampa. This is typical Leafs, so who knows? I back them in any 7-game series. I just think they're exciting and they can cause some upsets, but I just think the consistency is going to be their weak point this year.
And dropping a game to Buffalo, I noticed you failed to mention that one.
Yeah,
they seem to be able to beat some of the best teams in the league and struggle against some of the bottom end teams as well. Well, I remember one of our first podcasts, Ash, you and I talked about the Las Vegas expansion team, and I don't think a few months later either of us would have expected them to be where they are. I saw an interesting stat the other day, since you've brought up the Toronto Maple Leafs. In their very first season as a franchise, the Las Vegas Knights have tied the Toronto Maple Leafs all-time franchise record. So obviously they're successful this year, and will be interesting to see who comes out of the West. I also like Nashville. I think they're going to be dominant again. But it's hard for me to think that anyone other than Tampa Bay is going to take it.
Oh, really, eh?
Yeah, I think they're the real deal.
Okay. Well, even with Boston, I mean, a few weeks ago it was nailed on that the Leafs were going to be playing Boston in the playoffs, and now it looks, well, I think it's actually in Boston's hands now where they finish. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see what the final standings are there, first, second, third. I think Nashville is strong, obviously getting to the final last year. I can't see much further than them. I do think it's a shame this year that Ottawa and Edmonton are already out. I mean, it was nice to have so many Canadian teams in there last year, which I think the year before there was 0 Canadian teams, if I remember rightly. Obviously, Winnipeg securing a spot as well. So there are a few Canadian teams this year, but it's a shame that. I love watching McDavid, so it's going to be a shame not to see him in playoff games. But
we'll have to be hoping for Winnipeg and the Leafs then.
Yeah, let's hope so. Yeah, I mean, Winnipeg is one of those teams that just go under the radar. They don't get much coverage media-wise, but they just go about their job really well, winning games. So
yeah, and getting hot at the right time too.
Yeah. All right, so that kind of brings us to an end of the 4th podcast. We're going to be back again kind of next month for another one. So thanks a lot, and we'll speak to you soon. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Be sure to visit our website at hockeyfansintraining.org and on social media, Twitter and Instagram at HockeyFit2014 and Facebook and LinkedIn at Hockey Fans in Training. Thanks again.